Cambridge. It's a city that tries to live the inclusivity dream. And up to the abolishment of rent control in the late 1990s, it managed to balance out the demands of town and gown and be a city where people of all economic strata could call home. Walk around Kendall Square with all the new construction and sparkling high-rises for tech businesses and their employees, and it feels like the best of times. A short walk west to the Port, the poorest neighborhood in the city, and it's the worst of times. Families who have lived here for generations are being priced out, ripping apart the very fabric of the neighborhood. Like so many other cities that are part of the high-tech boom, Cambridge is forced to grapple with the competing demands of their citizens, now clustered at the opposite ends of the privilege spectrum. Audible has collaborated with the Loop Lab on a series of pieces about the Port neighborhood, and in this piece, we first talk with Melinda Barboza about the effects of the loss of rent control and the work she is doing with Cambridge schools to deal with the many challenges facing the city around this issue. We then interview Gigi and Dami, young women from Cambridge, about what it feels like to be strangers in parts of their own city.
I'm Melinda Barboza. I work with Cambridge youth programs in the past, and I've been working with the city for about 10 years.
Oh, okay. So I date the beginning of the current gentrification to getting rid of rent control. And so I was wondering if you have anything that you can, if you have a perspective that dates back that far. I know it's 1997 or so when that went out, and what losing rent control has done to the city of Cambridge.
Yeah, I think I came into working to the city after that, and so I'm in the work of like seeing what the consequences have been. Right, I came into working with young people where we were saying like, oh, the young people are moving out. Not the same kids live here anymore. Not the same kids go to our centers anymore. Who is still in the school? So I've been around after the questions have been asked from what happened after rent control, right? So for me, it was only that thing that lingered, like this happened before, and now we're seeing what the consequences or what the space looks like.
Right. And so could you elaborate more about what the consequences have been?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I could... Well, for me, it is what it is, right? The city just looks like a city that's shifted of who can live here and who can't live here. And so I think when people talk about Cambridge being the city of like two different cities living in one space, I see that. I worked in North Cambridge for a really long time where you can see that disparity, right, from the young people who came into our program, right? So you had young people who came in whose parents are professors at Harvard and with lots of like education privilege. And then you have young people who are living in housing development and they're in the same space and you're trying to figure out how do you provide programming for young people who have needs that are really different. How do you accommodate different families? I think for us, it's always been, and also who gets spots in spaces and how do you create equitable programming or access to those for young people.
So how do you make those selections?
One is that you have to be intentional about who you're trying to get in your building, right? So you can't just say, so in youth programming, you can't just say, first come, first serve, because we know who's going to show up first, right? And so
it's the Harvard kids.
Yeah, because they're thinking in April, like, I got to think about next semester and I have to make sure that my child has somewhere to go after school. And the parent who's working multiple jobs or the parent who is just juggling a lot or is just thinking like, there'll be a place because I live in Cambridge and there should be a space for a young person to go because my child deserves somewhere. And like Cambridge has always been that, right? Like we've never had to think about that because there's so many resources. And so intentionally it's been saying first come, first serve doesn't work. And so we have to shift what that is. And it was about lots of intentional recruitment and telling parents like, yeah, I know it's important for you to have your child here. And there are young people who also deserve to be here. And so you don't get that spot just because you showed up first at my door.
Right.
And I think it's about having people in power also admit to that and say, how do we shift it? But it's not easy. No. And the person-to-person conversations are much harder than the policy that goes out, right?
Yeah, totally.
Because that's the thing about community.
Yeah.
It's been really fascinating. They're doing lots of the courageous conversations across schools. Cambridge is doing Cambridge Goes Deep to talk about race, which I think is played into this gentrification piece, right? Like families who've lost out big around rent control have been African-American families who've been here for years. And so who's getting pushed out typically looks like people of color.
Right.
And there are families who talk about like my great-grandfather lived here. And that's so different than like, oh, we just moved here because it's a great city to live in.
Right.
Yeah, and so I think people are starting to have the conversations, but you read articles in Cambridge Chronicle where people are talking about like race and people are talking about what spaces should look like. So I think people are starting to recognize it's an issue, but we have deep work to do here because Cambridge like pretends to be, or is this liberal place,
Right.
where everyone ideologically believes that like everyone should be welcomed and everybody, we have that, and that's great. And when it comes up to like, would I be willing to sacrifice something to give someone else a spot, or would I be willing to sacrifice a piece of the privilege I have? I think that's not where we are yet, and the country's not on that. But Cambridge seems like a space that should be the one who's pushing, right? Like,
yes, it wants to be that.
It does, and I really believe that. I believe
Yeah,
in the hope
me
of the
too.
city. Like,
Yeah.
I have to say, like, I love this city because of that. It's the
Right.
only place. I'm from Somerville,
Uh-huh.
and gentrification's done its own thing there. I grew up there my whole life, and what that looks like is really different than when I grew up. But I think Cambridge has the want to be better than what the world is. Like, we
Right.
believe it's possible. But how do we have those honest conversations, or how do people give up a little bit?
Right.
It's not so easy.
Yeah, no.
And you can feel that in conversations or when you're in, I don't know, yeah.
So tell me more about the programs in the schools to increase awareness and have these conversations.
Yeah, one of the projects I'm working on now is with American-born Black families out of our middle school, and we're meeting with them to talk about school stories and talk about their experience with education. And it's been really clear that like the way they've experienced the school system in Cambridge is really different than how white families experienced it. Like the trauma around schools for them as parents comes into play of how they're entering the space and how they're feeling welcomed. I see the school's doing a really good job of really labeling like, yeah, we know Black families are not feeling welcomed, but how do we get them to talk about it? So the principal hired us to come in and come talk to them. And it's been really interesting to hear some parents say things like, I send my child to school every day knowing it's a war zone and that I'm setting them for battle. And that's such a different experience of what other families would say, like, I love Cambridge schools, like my child's getting so much and all these opportunities. And so you hear that, that's where, but also that what's coming out of that is parents are saying, I've never had a space where I could just sit with other Black families and talk about this. Like, that's amazing.
Yeah, that is
right?
incredible. Right.
And so, yes, it's awful that they're having these experiences. What's great is that at least the leadership is saying we have to do something really different to change the problem. And they're open to whatever recommendations come out of that group. But that's felt really promising to say, like, yeah, people want to do this.
War zone, that's a very extreme term.
And real.
Yeah. If you had a technology magic wand to wave to solve a problem in Cambridge, what would you do?
I'll go back to what the families in my group I work with during the school stories, what they would say, and they believe this, like around they want their children to wake up and go to school every day and they want to learn. One thing that's been really interesting is that parents like, I want academics to be harder, and they want it to feel more rigorous. They want their children to be curious. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I would take that magic wand for them and give them the school experience they've been asking for, where they feel like their children can go and really become their best selves. Like, they believe school is the way to become free. They believe school is the way to practice liberation. And so making a space where all young people in the city can feel that they all have the ability or the potential to go to any school they want to go to, or any field. And I guess that's hope, right? Or it's...
So my name is Galencia, also known as Gigi. I'm 21 years old. I go to Bunker Hill Community College. I'm currently majoring in criminal justice. I want to be a resource officer in Cambridge. For me, walking over that train tracks, it's just like, it's a reminder that I'm stepping into a different world and that I have to be, aware of where I am, especially with a lot of racism going on and a book being judged by its cover. It's like to change your scenery, put your volume down, and making sure that, you're around people. Sometimes people walk by you in Kendall and they don't even say, excuse me, they just bump into you. And it's hard because it's always a white person. You don't know if they did it by accident, or if they did it on purpose, or they're just doing it because they see. And if I cause a scene, I might be called crazy. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So you don't want to be called that. So you're just like, okay, I'm calm. Woosah. All about that. And it's, it's hard sometimes, but you get used to it. Once you cross over those train tracks, it's a reminder. Once I cross back going home, I'm like, I'm in my zone. I'm in my neighborhood. I'm good.
So you feel more safe
mm-hmm.
in your neighborhood than you do in Kendall Square?
Definitely, because police officers know me. And, you know, anybody who sees me around the neighborhood knows me. My neighborhood is basically with Cambridge housing and all that. And once you pass like 7-Eleven on Main Street, you just start seeing different restaurants, probably restaurants I'll never go into, like the Catalyst, like Area 4. So it's just like different buildings, and you see like they're serious places, they're office places. You're just like, woo, that's a tall building. And it's just like when you walk through there, it's different because it's like it's a working place and you don't know what's going on or what's being done there. So you just feel weird in a way, what's being done. It's just like a place where you're wondering what's going on.
My name is Damila Oluwale. With a Nigerian accent, my name is Damila Oluwale.
Okay.
I'm from Cambridge, born and raised. I went to Cambridge Line High School. I went to Historical Black College, Morgan State University. I currently go to UMass Boston. And I'm the lead youth worker for the teen program.
Great. Okay, great. So what happened that made you realize your neighborhood was changing?
Well, for the longest time, you know, for me, Cambridge is a bubble. For the longest time, like I wasn't really aware, I guess I would say, until I left Cambridge. Like, though, you know, things are changing, being from here, because it's so diverse and it's so homey, that homey feeling here, I didn't know, like, my neighborhood was changing per se. Like, I knew things were different, but I'm like, it just wasn't really a change until I went to school in Baltimore, where they're experiencing different type of gentrification than we are. And I'm like, wow, this isn't here in Cambridge anymore. And I took the time to really look around and notice my city. And I'm like, it's not the same place. It's a different place. And it's kind of like when we're from Cambridge, it's like we close the eye. Like, we don't pay attention. We don't really view things. Like, because it's our city, we love it. But we have to realize, like, things are changing, you know? With, like, every time you go to Kendall Square, you see a new building. Every time you go down the street, walk down the street, there's a new condo going up. More people who grew up from Cambridge don't live here anymore, can't afford it. So, yeah.
So did a lot of your friends move out during your school years?
Yeah, I remember my best friend in kindergarten, he had to move. They moved to like Andover. It's so far. And even some of my friends I did graduate with, by the time their parents only stayed and it was hard for them to stay in Cambridge until they graduated, and now they live in La La Land.
Yeah. So they sort of hung in there, pay those higher rents to get their kid through school, and then.
Like, I could probably count on my hand how many black families I know who still own a house in Cambridge. My mom being one of them. So, it's definitely, and I remember growing up, there was way more.
Do you think that people in Cambridge are aware that this is a big problem?
Not everybody in Cambridge. I would say certain neighborhoods understand what's going on, but others are just like they're comfortable with the buildings going up. And old Cambridge cares, but new Cambridge doesn't, if that makes sense. So people who are from Cambridge all their life, they're like, yep, the building's going up. People who came to Cambridge in the last 10 years are like, yeah, they're bringing this new coffee shop, or yeah, see the nice Google building? They're excited for these things, but is it really benefiting our community? I would say old Cambridge is people who grew up in the youth centers, people who remember Tim the ice cream man from North Cambridge, or Randy who when he came to the schools and we used to try to get like trinkets from him. That's old Cambridge. Old Cambridge is like, you know, when there was a Manhattan's in Central Square and there was a Burger King in Central Square. Not a Amazon or Police Hub. Like, old Cambridge is, you have that sense of when you could leave your door unlocked because you knew no one's gonna come into your house. Or it's like, your mom went to school with his mom and you guys know each other forever. That's old Cambridge to me. It's like, everybody's a community, everybody knows each other. Moving to Cambridge just because of the limited resources. New Cambridge it's definitely an educated group. I want to say old Cambridge is not educated, but it's like, Old Cambridge was more diverse. I think New Cambridge is becoming very white. And it's like this neighborhood, like down in the port, you have that huge high rise over there. It's just like, can somebody from that part of Cambridge afford to live there? It's like $3,000 for a studio bedroom apartment. That's where New Cambridge is gonna go. Why? And then New Cambridge is trying to move MIT students into the projects and taking away project space. That's what New Cambridge to me is just like. It's kicking out the old to bring in the new, literally.
Feeling safe, being acknowledged, just being seen, whether it is in school or on the city streets. These are the daily struggles that these women face as they navigate through bustling Kendall Square. The high-tech community has no real presence in their lives beyond the large buildings and fast-walking employees. Clearly, there is more than we can do to make Kendall Square a more inclusive and less forbidding place. Awareness is the first step.